Welcome to Story Planet, where every story is a journey of wonder. The Mist Train is a tender tale of quiet pauses, unexpected turns, and the soft magic that unfolds when you stop chasing the clock. It's a story of a man who missed his train and found something far more beautiful waiting instead. There are no grand adventures here, just warm fires, soft glances, and the kind of love that blooms in silence. Get cozy, relax, and let the story gently unfold. Perfect for unwinding before the night or whenever you need a moment of calm. Shall we begin? The train was gone. Edward Hastings stood at the edge of the empty platform, one gloved hand tightening around the handle of his worn leather bag. The distant echo of the train's whistle had already faded, swallowed by the hush of falling snow. The timetable posted on the station wall blinked uncertainly on the cracked screen. Cancelled, delayed, cancelled. He sighed. Maplebrook. He had never heard of the place before this morning, and he certainly hadn't planned on stopping here. But as fate, or rather faulty rail signals would have it, this quiet village tucked somewhere between the city and nowhere had brought his journey to a pause. Edward took a deep breath. Cold air filled his lungs, crisp and clean like fresh linen, and for a moment he just stood there, listening. No city horns, no rushing footsteps, no buzz of urgency, only the wind weaving through the bare trees. And the distant clinking of something metal, maybe wind chimes or a swinging gate. He adjusted his coat and looked around. The station was barely more than a hut, an old bench, a ticket booth sealed shut with a sign that read, "Back in 10 minutes, though no one had appeared for the last 40. With a reluctant exhale, he started walking. A path curved away from the station and into the village, bordered by frosted hedges and old cobblestone. Maplebrook looked like it had once been painted in the colors of storybooks, quaint rooftops with curling smoke, shops with wooden signs, windows framed by lace curtains, and trees that reached over the road like they were holding hands above him. Just as he began to wonder where he'd sleep, or if he'd be sleeping at all tonight, he saw it. A sign, handwritten, crooked, "The Lantern Nest, Lodging and Tea." Below it, an arrow pointed toward a narrow path lined with mossy stones. He hesitated. There was something oddly inviting about the name. The Lantern Nest. It sounded warm, like a place where the lights were always low and the blankets smelled of chamomile. With nowhere else to go, Edward followed the path. The inn was a 2-story house nestled behind tall fir trees. Ivy curled around the porch railing, tiny golden lanterns hung along the eaves, their soft light flickering like distant stars. Wind chimes clinked gently like silver whispers. Edward stepped onto the wooden porch. It creaked under his weight and knocked. Moments passed. Then the door opened with a gentle squeak. She was there. Clara. She wore a thick cardigan and fingerless gloves. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, a few wisps of hair escaping her bun. Her eyes, soft brown, the kind that reminded him of an old book cover, blinked at him curiously. "Missed the train?" she asked. Edward gave a quiet laugh. "Just barely." She nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. "You're not the first. Come in, it's cold." The warmth hit him as soon as he stepped through the doorway. Soft yellow lamplight, the scent of cinnamon, and something floral, maybe lavender. Wooden floors that creaked like they had stories to tell. The front room was small but inviting, woven rugs, a fireplace crackling low, a sofa that looked like it belonged in a grandmother's favorite memory. A large black cat was curled on an armchair, one eye lazily opening as Edward passed. Clara moved quietly, her presence calm, almost lyrical. "Room's upstairs. Only one guest tonight. Looks like you'll have the whole place to yourself. Tea first? You look like you need it." Edward hesitated. "I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble if you like honey in it," she said over her shoulder, already heading toward the kitchen. He smiled. He sat by the fire while she brewed the tea. From the other room came the faint clink of porcelain, the soft hum of her voice, not a tune he recognized, but pleasant. Something about the way she moved made the space feel lived in, real. She returned with 2 mugs and handed him one. Their fingers brushed, barely, but it was enough to draw Edward's gaze upward. "It's lavender chamomile," she said, sitting across from him. "Helps the nerves unwind." He took a sip. It was perfect. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and quiet, like a lullaby in white. "You live here alone?" he asked after a pause. Clara nodded, her gaze flickering to the window. "I inherited it a few years ago. It's not much, but it's enough." Edward looked around. "It's lovely, like something out of a dream." She smiled, not wide, just a small turn of the lips that seemed honest. For a while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The fire cracked. The clock ticked softly. Snow whispered against the window panes. He found himself watching the way she held her mug, the way her thumb traced the rim, not deliberate, just instinctive, graceful in its own small way. She noticed, but she didn't look away. Later, she showed him to his room. The hallway was narrow and filled with framed drawings, birds, trees, a map of stars. The room itself was small but inviting. A thick quilt layered the bed, a bookshelf leaned against the wall, filled with well-loved paperbacks and a ceramic owl used as a bookend. "Let me know if the radiator makes too much noise," she said. He turned to her at the doorway. "Thank you for everything." She shrugged gently. "You missed a train, not kindness. Sleep well, Edward." He stood there for a while after she left, just taking in the quiet. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady, soft. He didn't know it yet, but something had shifted. Not loudly, not even visibly, but deep within the corners of his heart, a door had opened, just a crack, and light, golden and warm, had begun to seep in. He lay down, eyes on the ceiling. Somewhere below, he heard her humming again, soft, soothing, familiar somehow. And for the first time in years, sleep came easy, not because he was tired, but because he finally felt still. The morning arrived slowly, in shades of pearl and soft gold, brushing the windows with light that tiptoed into the corners of the inn. Edward awoke to the faint scent of bread baking, and the sound of gentle clinking from below, like spoons against porcelain. He lay still for a moment, half cocooned beneath a thick quilt, the room drowsy with warmth. He blinked against the morning light and listened. He couldn't remember the last time he'd woken up without a buzz or a beeping alert, without the rush of plans waiting on his phone. Here, the only thing waiting was the sound of Clara moving through the kitchen, her steps soft, deliberate. He imagined her tying her apron, checking the oven, placing plates like setting the rhythm of a song only she knew. The thought of her, the way she seemed to carry quiet like it was a language, made something stir inside him. Not romance, not desire, not yet. Just curiosity. He dressed slowly, brushing the creases from his shirt, and stepped into the hall. The scent grew stronger, cinnamon, maybe cloves, and something buttery. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw her through the archway of the kitchen, standing at the counter, humming under her breath. She turned just as he stepped in. "Good morning," she said, her voice still soft, as if afraid to wake the walls. Her smile was small but certain. "Slept well?" Edward nodded, brushing his fingers over the back of a chair before sitting. "Better than I have in months." Clara tilted her head thoughtfully, as though she were filing that bit of information away in a drawer marked meaningful. Then she placed a steaming mug in front of him, the scent of mint and lemon rising in a gentle cloud. "There's porridge warming on the stove. Fresh bread, too. I hope you like honey." "I do." She turned, and he watched the way the light caught in her hair, the way she moved through the kitchen, like it belonged to her and she to it. Everything in this inn had a kind of softness, a quiet way of existing, and Clara was no exception. She was part of it, not apart from it, like a candle inside a lantern, flickering but never fading. Over breakfast they talked. Nothing heavy, just gentle exchanges. His hometown, her favorite tea, the way the light hit the lake in October. She didn't pry, and neither did he. Their conversation wove itself into the morning like embroidery, fine threads looping in and out. He told her he wrote once, but hadn't in years. "Why did you stop?" she asked. He paused, took another sip. "I think I forgot how to listen to myself." She didn't rush to respond. Instead, she pushed the honey closer to him and said, "Then maybe you need quieter places." The day passed slowly. Outside, the snow fell in hushed intervals. Inside, the fire was lit early. Clara brought down old board games and offered to show Edward the attic, which she had slowly been turning into a reading nook. He followed her up the narrow stairs, and the space at the top was exactly what he expected, and yet more. Sloped ceilings, a round window overlooking the woods, a rocking chair tucked beside a small table, and stacks of books in no particular order. Fairy lights framed the wooden beams. There was a scent of old paper and dried lavender. "It's still a work in progress," she said, running a hand along the windowsill. "It's perfect." She glanced at him then, and for the first time held his gaze a little longer. That evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and a light supper warmed the kitchen, Clara returned to the sitting room with 2 mugs of cider. Edward had taken to one of the old armchairs, a blanket draped over his lap, a novel half open in his hands. "What are you reading?" she asked, curling into the opposite chair. He held it up. "Poetry, Robert Frost, a good one for cold nights." He flipped to a dog-eared page and read aloud, softly. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep." His voice trailed off at the familiar line. He looked up. Clara was watching him with a kind of quiet that made the air feel heavier and lighter at once. "Would you ever write again?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe, if I stayed here long enough." A pause. "Then maybe you should," she said, as though it were the simplest answer in the world. Night settled over Maplebrook like a lullaby, the kind only stars and wood smoke understood. Clara lit candles one by one. The light glowed golden across the walls, dancing in the glass frames and catching in her hair. They played a quiet game of chess, the pieces old and mismatched. Edward lost, but he didn't mind. He noticed how her eyes sparkled when she teased him, how her laugh was never loud, but lingered like something floral in spring air. When she reached for the rook and her fingers brushed his, neither of them flinched. She simply moved the piece. And he, for the first time in years, felt the absence of loneliness. Before she went upstairs for the night, Clara paused at the foot of the stairs. "You'll still be here tomorrow?" Edward looked up from the fire. "The train's still not running?" "Oh, it might be," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting. "But maybe that's not the point." He didn't answer, but he knew. Later, as he stood at the window in his room watching snow gather softly on the branches outside, he caught his reflection in the glass. His expression was different. Less tired, more something. He touched the note Clara had left for him on the dresser. "Sleep comes easier when you've shared stories." He smiled. That night, he dreamed of firelight, of stars in the attic window, and of a hand reaching across the chessboard just to rest near his own. A gesture without promise, but full of possibility. And that was more than enough. The world would still be there tomorrow, but for now, so was she. The morning crept in slowly, like a guest unsure if it should knock. Pale light filtered through the curtains, catching on dust motes that danced as though stirred by dreams. Edward woke before the sound of birdsong. There was a stillness in the room that felt sacred, untouched. He sat on the edge of the bed for a while, not rushing. His bag was still packed, resting against the armchair where he'd left it. The train schedule lay beside it, creased from his pocket, the ink slightly smudged. He glanced at the time, then toward the window. The snow had softened into a light frost, the kind that sparkled rather than buried. The sky was the color of a soft pearl, and for a moment Edward forgot the city, the meeting, the urgency that had once held him so tightly. Downstairs, the scent of rosemary scones curled through the air like a whisper. He made his way to the kitchen, where Clara was plating breakfast beside the open window. She didn't turn when he entered, but she smiled. "The train comes at 10, she said softly, almost teasing. "I know." She looked over her shoulder. "Still leaving?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. Instead of answering, he sat at the table and watched her move. The light danced across her cheekbones, her sweater sleeves pushed up, a small smear of flour near her elbow. He reached for the teapot she had just set down and poured them both a cup. "It's odd," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd hesitate." Clara placed a small jar of honey on the table between them. Sometimes hesitation is the body's way of telling us the truth before the mind's ready to accept it. He looked at her, and for a second, neither of them smiled, neither of them looked away. An hour later, Edward stood at the Maplebrook train station. The platform was still empty, the same crooked bench, waiting like a memory. A small bird pecked at the snow near the track. The train was due in 5 minutes. He held his ticket in his hand. Clara hadn't walked with him. She had said goodbye at the door with a mug in her hand and a soft, safe journey. But there had been something in her eyes, something unsaid. The train's whistle sounded in the distance. Edward's breath caught in his chest. He thought of the attic nook, the lavender books, the way Clara's fingers curled around a tea mug when she listened. He thought of that quiet kind of laughter that lingered between them like fog in the morning. The train approached. He looked down at the ticket, then back toward the village, and then he turned around. He didn't board. Clara was in the garden behind the inn when he returned. Her back was to him, hair tied up in a loose braid, boots muddy from tending the herbs. She didn't turn. "Forgot something?" she asked without looking. Edward stepped closer, his voice quiet. "Myself." This time she turned. Their eyes met, and for once there was no hesitation. The hours unfolded gently. Edward helped patch a gap in the fence that bordered the backyard. Clara brought out lemon cake and blackcurrant tea. The children from the nearby cottage passed by, tossing snowballs and waving. One of them called Edward Sir, and he smiled for what felt like the first time in years. He found himself sitting on the porch after sunset, a blanket draped over his lap, a notebook open and untouched beside him. Clara joined him with 2 cups of warm cider, sitting close, not quite touching, but close enough. "Do you always come back when you miss a train?" she asked. "No," he said. "Just this one." She nodded, a small sound of understanding. The moon rose slowly, casting silver light across the frost-covered trees. A fox darted through the garden's edge. The only sounds were the crackling of the hearth inside and the steady rhythm of two people breathing next to each other. The next morning, Edward didn't pack. He helped Clara bring down a box of winter linens from the attic. They laughed when they found a pair of mittens knitted so large they looked like oven mitts. He tried them on. Clara laughed until she snorted, then covered her face, embarrassed. He watched her, the light in her eyes, the way she folded into joy. He hadn't known a home could have a heartbeat, until now. Later that day, Clara pointed toward the far corner of the inn's yard. "I've been thinking of building a small greenhouse there, something simple, herbs, maybe a few vegetables in spring." Edward followed her gaze. "I've always wanted to try planting tomatoes." "Really?" "No?" he chuckled. "But I think I'd like to want it." She laughed, and the sound was like soft bells, not loud, not dramatic, but lovely. "Well," she said, "it's a start." As the days passed, Edward fell into rhythm. He swept the porch steps after snowfalls. He read in the attic nook. He started scribbling lines in his notebook. Hesitant at first, then with more confidence. Clara never asked to read them. She only brought him tea and left it beside the armchair, a silent kind of encouragement. He liked that about her. She didn't fill silence with noise, she filled it with presence. One night, when the sky was clear and the stars so bright they felt close enough to touch, Clara brought a blanket and sat beside him on the porch swing. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The city?" She nodded. Edward looked ahead, then down at his hands. "I think I miss the person I thought I was supposed to be. And now? Now? I think I'm becoming someone I actually like." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. Then she reached for his hand, fingers laced, gently, no words. And under the stars, the silence between them bloomed, not empty, not waiting, just full of something quietly beautiful. Neither of them said goodnight when they parted. They didn't need to. Winter deepened, and so did everything else. Edward Hastings no longer kept track of train schedules. He stopped checking his phone, which now lay tucked in a drawer beneath Clara's hand-stitched linens, untouched for days. Time, once measured in back-to-back meetings and tightly wound minutes, had softened. It drifted like snow through the quiet rhythm of days at the lantern nest. The days did not rush, they unfolded. Morning sunlight slid through lace curtains and landed on the kitchen table, warming the wood where Clara kept a bowl of winter oranges and a jar of dried lavender. Edward had grown fond of that table, not for eating, but for sitting, writing, thinking, watching her move in the kitchen while the kettle whistled and soft jazz played on the old radio. He had started writing again. At first, it was hesitant, small lines scribbled in a notebook she found in the attic, blank and a little yellowed with time. Then, gradually, they turned to stanzas, paragraphs, pages. The words felt unfamiliar and tender, like knocking on a door he hadn't visited in years. Clara never asked to read them, but she often left fresh tea beside his elbow, and every now and then a folded napkin with a line of her own. Snow remembers the shape of footsteps, even when we forget where we were going. He kept every one. They had not spoken of what was growing between them. It was there in the pauses, in the glances, in the way they moved around each other, like pieces of a puzzle not forced, but meant to meet. When she stood beside him, brushing flour from her cheek with the back of her hand, he'd reach without thinking and gently swipe the rest away. When she read on the porch, tucked beneath a blanket, he'd bring her hot cocoa without a word, just the soft weight of the mug in her hands. No declarations, no urgency, just them. One morning, Clara woke him with a knock. Not urgent, not loud. "Come help me?" Outside, the frost had painted every window pane with lace. She led him to the attic, where sunlight pooled on the wooden floor and dust danced like golden pollen. There, tucked in the far corner beneath the slanted ceiling, was an old wooden chest. "I want to turn this corner into a library nook," she said, "but I can't move this alone." They cleared it together, laughing as it creaked and protested. Inside were forgotten things, old postcards, a few hand-bound books, dried flower petals tucked between pages, and a pair of mismatched mittens. Clara lifted one, smiling. "I knit these when I was 10. For my cat, she hated them." Edward laughed, a sound that felt wide and easy. They sat amid the dust and memory, thumbing through the artifacts of someone's youth. He handed her a letter, faded ink, addressed to a child from a parent long gone. Clara grew quiet. He didn't ask. Instead, he reached for her hand, not to hold it, but to rest his fingers lightly atop hers. Just enough to say, "I'm here." By afternoon, the corner had transformed. Books lined the windowsill, a thick rug softened the floor, and two chairs, worn but comfortable, faced each other beside a table now home to a flickering lantern. Edward settled in. "You'll read to me?" Clara asked that evening, her voice barely above the hum of the wind. He opened a book of poems and read. She closed her eyes and listened, and the room, the house, the world outside, all faded until there was only breath and words and the space between them. That night, snow began to fall in earnest. It fell soft and slow, cloaking the village in silence. The fireplace crackled downstairs. Edward woke around midnight, not from a noise, but from a feeling. The kind that pulls you out of sleep without reason. He slipped on his sweater and padded downstairs. Clara was already awake. She sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting firelight. "Couldn't sleep either?" he whispered. She shook her head. "Too quiet." He sat beside her. The blanket shifted. She offered him an edge without speaking. He took it. They sat like that, the hush of the world folding around them, breath visible in the firelight, hearts steady. After a long time she spoke. "Do you ever wonder if maybe some moments are all we get?" He turned his head. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, pulling the blanket tighter. I think about how fleeting this feels. You, me, this snow, as though it'll melt or change or drift away the moment we name it." Edward was quiet. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. "Then let's not name it," he said. Her eyes shimmered, and she smiled, a real one that reached every part of her. Christmas came quietly. Maplebrook didn't boast or dazzle. It whispered its holiday spirit in windowsill candles and pine wreaths on every cottage door. Clara baked cinnamon bread. Edward chopped kindling. They hosted a tiny gathering in the inn's common room, 4 neighbors, a tray of warm cider, and carols sung softly by the fire. There was no mistletoe, no grand kiss. But Clara slipped her hand into Edward's beneath the table as the music played, and his thumb brushed gently over her knuckles, again and again. That night, they walked through the village under a sky swept clean of clouds. Stars glittered like frost in the heavens. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When they reached the top of the hill where the village light met the edge of forest, Clara turned to him. "I'm glad you missed your train." He chuckled softly. "So am I." She rested her head on his shoulder, and under the stars, beneath the hush of snow and the slow drift of time, they stood still and let the moment stay. Back at the inn, they settled into the attic nook, 2 mugs of peppermint tea, a blanket shared, no words, just the soft turning of pages and the kind of quiet only love could hold. And when they finally rose to part for the night, Edward paused at the stairs. "Clara?" She turned. He stepped close. Their breath mingled, visible, warm in the space between. He didn't rush, and when their lips met, it was not a beginning, not an end, but something gently becoming. Later, as they each lay in their rooms, hearts slow and full, the snow continued to fall. Outside, the world was hushed. Inside, something new had taken root. Quiet, certain, home. Edward would never board that train. He had already arrived. Thank you for listening. If this quiet story found a place in your heart, consider giving it a gentle thumbs up and sharing it with someone who might be waiting for their own missed train. For more bedtime stories wrapped in warmth and wonder, subscribe if you haven't already. There's always room for one more traveler on Story Planet. Also explore the playlist that has 100+ stories crafted for you to relax, unwind, or simply drift into calm whenever you need it. Good night and sweet dreams from Story Planet.